The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Donald Trump has fired his campaign manager, Corey Lewandowski. There is every indication that the Trump campaign is increasingly in disarray. They have just a hair over $1 million available in cash for the campaign, which is about 35 times less than Hillary Clinton has. Not that I'm a big cheerleader of campaigns needing or having millions and millions of dollars, but that is sort of something you need right now. We already know about the claims that the campaign is very unorganized, inconsistent messaging, press representatives that are clueless. They claim they don't speak for the campaign, in spite of the fact that speaking for the campaign is what you do when you are a representative for the campaign to the press. And now Donald Trump has fired Corey Lewandowski, reportedly based on the significant influence from Trump's kids, including Ivanka Trump, who apparently, Lewis, has wanted Lewandowski out as early as that Michelle Fields incident, where Lewandowski was ultimately charged with assaulting her, as we saw on video. This apparently goes back a long way.
Yeah, I was kind of surprised to hear that. Didn't really know the kids were involved in any way, shape, or form or had influence over the campaign.
Yes, but they do.
Should they? Probably not. But would you say that up until this point, or up until maybe the assault incident, that this guy knew what he was doing and that he was doing a good job?
I think he's generally considered a pretty competent campaign strategist, and Trump seemed to be saying he'll definitely stand by him. He gave that bizarre press conference from his plane after Lewandowski was charged, and he said, of course Lewandowski isn't going to be fired. Trump stands behind his people. I think at one point he even said something about Corey Lewandowski is like a child to Donald Trump, like one of his kids. I mean, not like a child in terms of maturity. That could mean something else. Paul Manafort now becomes the campaign manager. Here's Corey Lewandowski on CNN saying he has no idea why he was fired. Instead, he went right into a pro-Trump talking point coma.
First, from your perspective, what happened? Why were you fired?
I don't know. I don't know the answer to that, but what I know is what we've been able to achieve in this election cycle has been historic. You know, we had a candidate who in June of last year announced he was going to run for president with no elective office experience in a field of 16 other people in the race plus him, who's gone on to do something historic, which was get almost 14 million votes and fundamentally change the way people look at politics. And I'm proud to have been a small part of that. And, you know, running as the outsider of this campaign, which he has done, running against the corrupt Washington, D.C. establishment and political correctness has been something I've been proud to be a part of.
Trump must know what he's doing. You could fire somebody and then they immediately go on TV and just recite talking points that are positive about your campaign. Now, let's be clear. Corey Lewandowski should have been fired a while ago. He did plenty of stuff worthy of getting fired, but the getting fired at this time is sort of what is showing the shakeup and the mix-ups that are happening in the campaign. And I saw a Trump surrogate, Scotty something. It's a woman, Scotty. I'm not sure what it's short for. This is a woman campaign surrogate of Trump. She went on CNN and she was asked, isn't this proof that the campaign's in disarray? And she said, no, this is a sign of how well things are going, that Donald Trump is always making the best decisions all the time, even though it's late in the game and some candidates might be afraid to change the campaign manager at this point. Trump is just he has such testicular fortitude in these points, Lewis, if you can imagine what I'm trying to get at, that he doesn't care. He'll make the change whenever if it's the right change, and relatively well-crafted damage control, I'll say.
Yeah, I don't think that firing your campaign manager right before the general election starts ramping up is actually that crazy. I mean, it's a different election. It's a different mentality. You have
in other words,
approach it
the strategy in the primary is a different strategy than in the general.
It is, of course.
If the general campaign starts abortively, as it has for Trump, maybe it's a logical time to change horses midstream.
I can't help but think there's something personal behind this, and there's something we're not being told. But, I mean, am I right? It is a different strategy. It's a different game.
There's no doubt, and it has not started particularly well for Donald Trump, as we've covered for the last 2 weeks. 19-year-old Michael Sandford was arrested at a Donald Trump rally after saying he wanted to kill the presidential candidate. Las Vegas Metropolitan Police arrested Michael Sandford over the weekend at Trump's rally at the Treasure Island Hotel and Casino. No better place for a Trump rally. I certainly can't imagine one. Sandford tried to take a police officer's gun, and officers quickly took him into custody. You'll see some video here that we're going to play for you of him being taken out from CNN. Court documents say that Sandford was identified by his driver's license from the United Kingdom, told investigators that he's been living in the United States for about a year and a half in Hoboken, New Jersey. If I came to the U.S. from the UK, I don't know that Hoboken's my first stop, but that's, to each their own, no doubt about that. Sandford allegedly told investigators he was practicing shooting at a nearby gun range just the day before the rally, and he said that that was the first time he had ever shot a gun. When officials asked him, why did you try to take this police officer's gun? He said, to shoot and kill Donald Trump, saying he fully expected to be killed himself during this attempt. He was transferred to the custody of U.S. Secret Service. He's been charged with attempting to commit an act of violence on restricted grounds. Yesterday, he was in court facing charges, faces 10 years in prison and a $250,000 fine if convicted, denied bail. The court was told that Mr. Sandford is unemployed, living out of his car at this point, and in the United States illegally. A court-appointed lawyer said he had autism and had attempted suicide in the past. Clearly an unbalanced individual, right, Lewis? I mean, never shot a gun. His plan was to go to Vegas, practice shooting once at a gun range, and then disarm a police officer and shoot Donald Trump with that gun.
And we have someone who is staying here illegally, living out of their car, seemingly just a mess. Some people might call us hypocrites and say, oh, this person's mentally ill, while maybe Omar Mateen wasn't. Well, I think we did address to some extent that Omar Mateen has an issue. But what I would like to add is that this guy didn't have a gun and couldn't pull off what he wanted to pull off. Partially, maybe mostly, because he didn't have a gun.
Well, some people online said, this kid's not autistic, he's a genius, as if the two are mutually exclusive. But in any case, the types of comments I was hearing was, no, this has nothing to do with whatever his mental state or status or conditions are. This has to do with the fact that he brilliantly realized, I'm not going to be able to bring a gun into the event because of Secret Service security. So I'll get in with no gun and then take one from a police officer. Of course, relatively short-sighted in that at the point at which you try to take a gun from a police officer, things are probably going to wrap up pretty quickly. The most shocking thing to me about this entire story is that AOL has been reporting extensively on it, and I'm shocked that AOL still reports extensively.
Yeah, I thought they were pretty much just doing email. Actually, as we discussed before, there's something still like 1 million people who have AOL as their internet service provider.
In all seriousness, of course, I disagree with all violence by and against the supporters or detractors of any candidate. It's interesting to consider that these attempts arguably help Trump. They do seem to be fomenting support. People see, oh, someone tried to kill Trump. It's because he's going to make America great again, although the countless plots to kill President Obama, more death threats than the CIA, than the Secret Service has dealt with for who knows how long against President Obama, the same people don't apply that logic. They don't say, oh, Obama must be really doing great because so many people want to kill him. Just very disjointed logic when it comes to how people react to these types of attempts and threats.
Yeah. I'm wondering now, the Trump campaign has not issued a statement on this, right? Have they?
I don't know. I'm not sure. They had plenty going on in the news cycle yesterday with the firing of Corey Lewandowski, interestingly enough. I have not heard, anyway. What could they possibly say?
It might be noteworthy.
I guess you're wondering, do they make any kind of broader political point that you can take from an individual autistic person in the country illegally who had never fired a gun before trying to disarm a police officer? Do they try to make some broader statement out of it?
Yeah. I mean, if I were Trump's campaign manager, I would say, let's ignore this one.
Yeah, I think I would too. Send me your thoughts about this. I'm on Twitter at @dpacman. Lewis is on Twitter at @LewisMotomedy. And of course, everybody is on Facebook at facebook.com/David Pakman Show.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Today's new member of the day is John Lewis. John, thank you so much for being a David Pakman Show member. We do depend on the support of viewers and listeners like John Lewis, and we have a great slate of membership benefits for everybody who signs up. You can learn more, sample most of the membership benefits, and sign up and get instant access at davidpakman.com/membership. Okay, there are fraud accusations spreading about about the Democratic primary, and many people have asked me to talk about this. I want to spend some time on it today. There are allegations that statistical analyses prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the Democratic primary was rigged by the DNC in favor of Hillary Clinton. There's some confusion about this, and the reason for part of that confusion is that within a very short time, different stories surfaced. One was that of a statistical analysis that was done, and there was another story of leaked emails purporting to show that the DNC was colluding with corporate media to push a Hillary nomination. So some people think this is all one story, and in a greater sense, it is sort of all related to the same point, but they're actually two different stories, and we should analyze them separately. First of all, two statisticians, Axel Geisel and Rodolfo Cortez, compared states that use hard paper evidence of votes to states that don't use paper ballots, and they found irregularities. They also compared election results with exit polls, noting that the difference between election results and exit polls in the Democratic primary 2016 was bigger than it was in 2008. And they theorized that the difference between exit polls and election results was bigger in states without paper trails because it is easier to rig elections when there is no paper trail. Now, without spending a ton of time on the specific math, because it's really the type of thing you want to sit with for a half hour and think about yourself whether it makes sense to you, there was something being sent around claiming to be a Stanford study, which implies, number one, that it was directly published by Stanford, and also that it was a study in the sense that it was peer-reviewed and it had widely accepted statistical analyses. This is not true. One of the two authors of this paper, and paper is the right term, works for Stanford, and the authors have acknowledged the claims and the research methodology were not subject to peer review. They were not subject to academic scrutiny. This was a paper, not a study. Now, Lewis, this doesn't change the validity of it, but it was being written about as if this is a completely academic, accepted, peer-reviewed, Stanford-sanctioned study, when in reality this was a paper done by two individuals, one of whom is associated with Stanford. This is a difference.
Mm-hmm. It's yes, it's a pretty huge difference. My next question would be, when people talk about exit data, that how much information did you really gather? I mean,
Right.
Is it enough to conclude that there is a certain and large difference between that and the voting results?
Well, in the paper, Geisel cites a number of sources to substantiate the claim that the fraud is well documented, but most of the citations involve people with some kind of interest in the overall dispute, including many groups that are parties to lawsuits. And if you're really thinking about this as an academic study, that's not something you will generally want to include. Now, this doesn't necessarily cast doubt on the validity of the results, but it's really important that when we talk about this, we make of it what we should rather than what some are reporting. This is by no means proof that there was no fraud. I want to make that absolutely clear, but what I want to try to do is inject some facts into what a few headlines on various blogs and news sites have not made clear. Now, that's number one. Number two, separately, there were some emails leaked by a hacker going by the name of Guccifer 2.0, which claimed to show that dating all the way back to May of 2015, the DNC was actively working to clean up Hillary Clinton's record, including on issues related to campaign finance and ethics and transparency. And there are also emails released claiming to show coordination between the DNC and corporate media outlets like CNN. Yeah, that's not a surprise to anybody. I mean, we've been covering that for a while, but it's important to keep these two stories separate. And I think that's what many of the reports and blog posts about this and people emailing me have failed to do. So, Lewis, not proof that there was fraud, not proof that there was not fraud, but let's consider all of this in context for what it is.
Yes, and we take the whole primary, and we know that shady things have been happening. We know that it has leaned towards Hillary Clinton because of Debbie Wasserman Schultz, and it's just the whole thing is pretty ugly. But I don't know if this study
of out and out fraud, as described in this paper, is a different story. I think is the point we're trying to make.
Yeah, and this is not proving that.
No doubt about it. Let's take a break. Next, our investigation into what we are calling the authoritarian left.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
We've talked about the so-called regressive left with you in the past, and one of the primary critiques of this concept is that it's just a pretense to criticize Islam or feminism and things like university safe spaces. And there's no doubt that those examples do come up, but in reality, the concept is an attempt to illustrate a larger authoritarian tendency among some on the left. To some, the term regressive left has become totally toxic and worthless, and I totally get that. So we can even set aside the term and talk about authoritarian leftism instead. The bigger picture is the phenomenon of supposed progressives using right-wing means of communicating and controlling people, and how left-wing authoritarianism is very distinct from real progressivism. It's not progressive to use right-wing means like censorship and us versus them rhetoric to neutralize bad ideas or promote progressivism. Using authoritarianism to enforce progressivism is a sort of paradox. Authoritarian leftists act as though the end result justify any means. If someone is, quote, progressive, they're automatically and morally and rationally in the clear and entitled to use whatever methods they deem necessary to advance their goals. These authoritarians use the progressive brand as a sort of facade to attract people who have an inclination towards progressivism, like the inherent values of benevolence and self-consciousness, and they use their supposed monopoly on progressivism to enforce their agendas. But many people are ending up being blind to this process because they're caught up in the righteousness that they feel from their association with a centralized set of beliefs and tactics. This defies the values of individualism, which is basic to progressivism, the idea of upholding personal independence and free agency. To that point, one of the most prevalent and innate facets of the authoritarian left is identity politics. It's also a foundational precursor for a lot of other manifestations of authoritarians on the left.
Just remember, there's a special place in hell for women who don't help each other.
Let's be clear that simply acknowledging the shared experiences and struggles between people of a certain group, like, say, the LGBT community or a certain ethnicity, in itself is helpful to positive social change. But here, what I'm referring to as identity politics is when this idea is twisted or taken to irrational lengths. Black Lives Matter is a movement that I completely support in almost all of its goals. It has ideas and missions with which I'm 100% on board because racism in America is present and thriving. Black and Latino people are far more likely to be pulled over by police, searched by police, more likely to be arrested, and they're more likely to be killed by police. And even if they're not killed, they're also more likely to be convicted than any other ethnic group, and they receive harsher sentences. But occasionally, There have been individual instances in which I've questioned some methods and tactics of those demonstrating under the Black Lives Matter umbrella. Some opponents of Black Lives Matter use these situations to characterize the entire movement, but I don't. There have just been some times where protesters made questionable moves in promoting their cause, such as this exhibition in a quiet Dartmouth library.
Black lives matter! 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 Do you think Black Lives Matter? Black lives matter! Black lives matter!
Or when two women contentiously took control of a Seattle, Washington Bernie Sanders rally.
Thank you, Seattle, for being one of the most progressive cities in the United States of America.
If you do not listen to her, your event will be shut down right now.
Bernie Sanders has been arrested during segregation protests. He supported Jesse Jackson's 1988 presidential campaign, in spite of Jesse Jackson's history of questionable comments about Jews, which is another story altogether. He has a long history of supporting welfare accessibility, voting rights, police reform, prison reform, and he has a 97% rating from the NAACP. Social and economic equality have explicitly and implicitly been the cornerstones of Bernie's career and of his 2016 presidential campaign. Some Sanders supporters in the crowd were vocally displeased with the two women's decisions to confiscate the stage. The women went on to yell at the crowd and call them white racists.
We are trying to be reasonable.
We are trying.
We're gonna let you on the mic.
I will speak when everyone is ready. I'll wait. You guys are full of bull with your Black Lives Matter. Listen, you're never gonna hear Bernie speak unless I hear it silent here now. We are going to have a moment of silence for Mike Brown for 4.5 minutes.
The illustration here of what makes identity politics so unreasonable is the bizarre, hostile reaction that some people have to those who question the productiveness of these women taking over a Bernie Sanders rally. Many people, black and white, react to these critiques with more accusations of racism. They'll say that if I disagree with any tactics by a movement like this, I'm less committed to the cause, or I'm not recognizing how truly marginalized they are. In fact, I was called a white supremacist after some comments I made about Black Lives Matter, at no point leaving in doubt my total support for the broader mission. There will be people who essentially say, if I don't have the same experiences as a group that is seeking social justice, then I have nothing valid to say about the strategies of two individual women, and that I must therefore appreciate and applaud anything they do. This kind of absolutism plainly defies the progressive notions of free thought and open debate.
Yeah, my name is Marissa Johnson, and I grew up with Tea Party parents, and I no longer believe that anymore. People are trying to go after my personal character and just derail and derail and derail. And that signals to me that the things that I said were spot on.
And perhaps some of the derailment, as you describe, was partly because of the tactic that was used.
Maybe you don't agree with my thoughts about the Bernie rally or the scene at the Dartmouth Library. Maybe I'm wrong and these events benefited the Black Lives Matter movement in some way I just can't see. But you should at least refrain from discounting my thoughts about political strategy based on my appearing to be white, and whether I am or not is a whole other point of debate. And you should recognize that a credible perspective can come from someone not necessarily belonging to the group that is fighting for justice, especially if that person is an avid supporter of the movement like myself. Otherwise, you're simply shutting down discourse in the interest of identity politics. Let's look at an analogy involving Donald Trump. As we've discussed, Trump's base consists significantly of people with less education and lower income, and those people suffer from the real problems in our economic system, problems that need to be fixed. And so the solution that they propose is to elect Trump and demonize Mexicans and Muslims, which are obvious missteps towards forwarding economic equality. But Would you say that a wealthy, educated liberal is not entitled to acknowledge the fallacies of low-income Trump supporters because rich people just don't understand what it's like to be poor, and that therefore a Trump presidency must be the correct answer to wealth inequality problems? Of course not, because economically disadvantaged people are individuals and wealthy people are individuals, and the merits of an idea are independent from however we might organize society into identity groups. This is why we have discussions about morality and politics to begin with, because absolute questions of right and wrong or honest discussions about the pragmatics of achieving justice should exist separately from people's emotional impulses or biases, including the tribalism and groupthink of identity politics. It detracts and distracts us from the empiricism and critical thinking that should be the basis of our analysis of any topic. Critical thinking, distinguishing good arguments from bad. Is an argument bad because of the identity of the person making it? The entire meme is akin to irrational populism and people having blind devotion to a political party. When we're talking about identity politics, whether it's ethnicities, religions, or any marginalized group, an important part of maintaining the narrative is through reinforcing the idea of victimhood. And many on the left act as if there's a sort of hierarchy of marginalization, that minorities and oppressed factions of society are somehow ranked according to our obligation to defend them. This also detracts from intellectual inspections of ideas and debates. Sometimes it's enforcing overbearing political correctness or demanding that people use special language. Authoritarian leftists often act as though they should be able to live in a world free from being questioned or offended, so they seek control over those around them, as well as the entire social atmosphere, by calling anyone who disagrees with them a bigot or a conservative or immoral. This is enforced by doing something else that's central to authoritarianism, obstructing freedom of expression or condemning certain speech in order to try to control culture and discourse. Twitter and Facebook have been known to silence conservatives in some instances. Twitter has actually even seen recent blows to their business that some speculate to be associated with this phenomenon, with unprecedented stock value plummeting and loss of usership. Many individual users on social media also employ similar practices, as we see, for example, a lot of radical proponents of social justice disabling comment sections on sites like YouTube in order to inhibit speech that doesn't reinforce their narratives. Democrats in government also have a history of trying to shape culture according to their social values and narratives by curbing free speech, from vilifying video game developers.
The ability of our children to access pornographic and violent material on an M-rated video game is spiraling out of control.
To censoring music.
We have always talked about the positive aspects of the music industry, but of course the highlight has been on the excesses that have been allowed to develop as we have tried to focus our concern on those excesses.
An inherent part of being authoritarian is silencing voices of opposition, as well as using media or hindering media to serve goals of molding society into what they want it to be. The best means of defeating right-wing ideas is to let them have a venue, to argue against them and expose them for how bad they are, not to employ right-wing tactics by trying to control conversations and zeitgeists. There have been far too many good examples throughout history and today of what this sort of left-wing authoritarianism can lead to if left unchecked. During the Cold War, many American leftists turned a blind eye to countless human rights abuses around the world simply because they were performed by ostensibly left-wing socialist governments. This includes genocide in Cambodia, any number of Chinese abuses of power, poverty and attacks on civil liberties in Cuba, a list of crimes against humanity in the Soviet Union. Throughout the 20th century, leftists in capitalist countries all over the world were apologists for governments like these because of their pretense of being socialist egalitarian states. Not only did left-wing authoritarianism grow to overwhelming and destructive degrees in these places, leftists in the West pretended, or were under false impressions, that these crises were benign because of identity politics, loyalty to labels like socialism, and often a fanatical desire to denounce the West and capitalism. Today, the habit of some leftists to oppose the U.S. and its allies at whatever cost of rationality can be seen in their pledge to deny or at least downplay the harmfulness of some authoritarian regimes in the Middle East. For instance, when it comes to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the standard impulse by Western leftists is to adamantly and relentlessly point out the wrongdoings of Israel against Palestinians, many of which are legitimate, that I agree with. I've criticized Israel many times on the show. Benjamin Netanyahu's right-wing government must go, as it's beholden to extremist reactionary politics and his alliances with the religious right elements of the government. I condemn Israeli settlements unconditionally. But there's a general habit among a large part of the left of rigidly asserting that progressives should unconditionally support Palestinians and chastise Israel without any nuance. Anyone who reasonably diverts from that paradigm often gets labeled as right-wing, and this is the type of otherizing that I've been talking about that's intrinsic to the authoritarian left, as well as the act of pretending that there are simple answers to extremely complex problems, refusing to have dynamic and refined positions, hostility versus thoughtful considerations and debate. Many act as though it's left-wing apostasy to acknowledge certain real phenomena among Palestinians, like misogyny, brutal and dogmatic anti-Semitism, clerical fascism, as well as certain realities about Israel, such as the legal establishment of the state, the fact that Jews have been living and migrating there for centuries, and the peace and territory proposals by Israel that have been rejected countless times by Palestinian authorities. Some on the left even go as far as becoming apologists for Hamas, ready to rationalize just about anything that Hamas does, no matter how heinous, even things that Israel has never been known to do. Hamas forces its population to stockpile weapons and accommodate terrorists inside mosques, hospitals, and United Nations aid buildings. They have a consistent record of declining and violating ceasefires, as well as using Palestinian civilians as human shields during Israeli counterattacks. They've deprived their people of basic freedoms like speech, press, and assembly, using brutal intimidation to deter dissent and protest, as well as diligently and often violently working to censor the reporting of any of these crimes. Venezuela is another modern example of the left's sometimes blind commitment to assail the United States. Leftists and socialists all over the West have praised Hugo Chavez, as well as the new and similar Maduro government, as exemplars of progressive leadership, simply for the sake of tribalistically remaining aligned with anti-American sentiment and what they mistake for progressive populism. Hugo Chavez was nothing close to an upholder of liberal values. His administration was massively corrupt by almost all valid measures. The 2008 Corruptions Perceptions Index by Transparency International ranked Venezuela as the 22nd most corrupt country in the world. Chavez and his inner circle were notorious for secrecy, bribery, cronyism, and giving impunity to government officials. Since Chavez's time in power, police corruption and parliamentary corruption have exploded in Venezuela. He hugely diminished Venezuela's checks and balances between different areas of government. He took control of the courts, he took control of the National Electoral Council, and he tried to change the constitution so that he'd be eligible for unlimited re-elections. Chavez also supported FARC terrorists in Colombia until it no longer suited his political interests. He vilified Jews. His government used violence against protesters and denied them due legal process. And he expelled workers with Human Rights Watch from the country for reporting on the corruption. And just between 2011 and 2014, over 31,000 complaints of human rights violations in Venezuela were reported to the United Nations. Only 3% of them resulted in indictments by the Venezuelan government. Not only is Venezuela an example of the left's apologetics for authoritarianism, it's an example of that into which American left-wing authoritarianism could hypothetically evolve if we accept censorship, social conditioning, and moral and intellectual elitism. Leftists are often willing to overlook these sorts of illiberalisms in the name of, quote, egalitarianism, and the American authoritarian left embodies many of these Chavez-like traits in milder ways. To be clear, my sense is that the leftists in places like the US who have authoritarian habits are probably well-meaning. Many are truly progressive, and they're just swept up by authoritarianism's inherent tendency to create this sort of in-crowd that I mentioned. They do this by creating norms in education and conversations that reinforce this political correctness and victimhood. Right-wing authoritarianism is often rooted in religion, often disguised as so-called family values and upholding capitalism and the Constitution, also reminiscent of religions to many on the right. American left-wing authoritarianism, on the other hand, is more rooted in emotion, absolutism, and the resulting narrow tunnel vision used in defending and promoting their causes, even if it means ignoring certain realities and progressive principles. The only thing that gives power to this new alt-right movement, which entails cultural libertarianism and a lot of anti-social justice warrior sentiment, is the left's momentum with these habits that we're talking about. People who are otherwise very left-leaning on many or most issues are feeling sort of obligated to call themselves conservatives or at minimum moderates because they don't want to identify with this aggression and ideological puritanism that is often manifesting on the left. It's what we should expect from people on the right, people like Donald Trump. It's the right's job to tell people how to think, how to speak and behave, to act like martyrs, constantly victimized by their opponents. It's the job of people like right-wing radio hosts who have long played their audience's fears by reinforcing victim narratives and the idea that everyone is out to get them and that they should just completely shut out anybody who disagrees with them. Authoritarian leftists are often relying less on facts and controversies to inform their rhetoric, and instead falling back on this otherization of anyone who opposes them, this mentality of you're either for us or against us. That is not what progressivism represents.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Sometimes after there's a mass shooting, there's almost an exclusive focus on that one incident. And it's easy to forget that while we're all talking about and thinking about that mass shooting, the victims, the shooter, the reaction, the investigation, shootings in America keep happening. And in fact, 500 more people have been shot in the United States since the Pulse nightclub shooting that we have been talking about so much. A 24-year-old was unintentionally shot and killed by a friend when they were play fighting with a rifle in New York City. There was a 48-year-old found shot to death in the passenger seat of a car in Little Rock, Arkansas. John Cloud, an 81-year-old, was shot and killed by 80-year-old Edward Akisto at a cemetery in Rhode Island. There's Regina Jeffries, 17 years old, who was killed in a shooting that wounded 3 others outside a vigil for teenage drowning victims in Oakland, California. During the 7 days between the end of that horrible incident at Pulse nightclub and the following Sunday at the same time, at minimum, 228 people were fatally shot across the country, according to the Gun Violence Archive, and 536 were shot but survived. So as much as these mass shootings in Orlando are devastating and are becoming of epidemic proportions in terms of how much more frequently they are happening, they account for under 2% of all deaths due to firearms. Now, we're not saying, Lewis, mass shootings aren't a problem. Of course we're not. What we are saying is that these single gun deaths, individual homicides, individual suicides, they make far less news. They account for overwhelmingly more deaths. Most homicide victims know their killers, and that's something that, when we talk about gun safety regulations, very often it's in the context of so-called mass shootings because those are the shootings that make more news. When we think about these individual shootings and we think about the fact that most homicide victims know their aggressor, it is even more obvious that the concept of arming everybody for self-defense is more and more ridiculous, because how many people are going to be in self-defense, let me be ready to pull my gun out to return fire around people they know, right? And I know there will be many people who see me and say, David, that's because you're naive and maybe you don't live in a place that's dangerous, or you don't have certain types of people in your family or friends or whatever. If your argument is that everybody needs to be ready to draw when hanging out at home or mowing their lawn because somebody you know might come over to shoot you, you're painting a very, very a grim reality about the state of the United States. And that's really what the focus should be on, if that's your reaction to what I'm saying.
Yeah, instead of thinking, well, maybe I want to live in a world where nobody has these guns and I can't just get shot at any given time. A world where I don't need to be ready to draw my gun every time. No, instead they think, yes, well, everyone needs to have a gun because I could just get shot at any time, and we don't need to change that reality.
And a lot of people will hear us say this, and they'll say, David, you're not going to change that reality, so you should be armed because that's just more practical. You can't change what everybody else does. You can't change what maybe they describe as a violent world, but you can decide to be armed yourself. And we will get emails that say that, and I would just remind them, look at the statistics about the circumstances of many of these shootings, the mass shootings and the individual ones, and really think specifically about how more guns in those scenarios would have solved the problem. In the overwhelming majority, it's hard to make a case that more guns would actually make the situation better. In some, you absolutely can.
Yep.
But by and large, it doesn't make any sense. Not long ago, Lewis, we talked about a dolphin being pulled out of the water so that tourists could take pictures with it. And the dolphin died. And we now have learned of a shark that died after a group of tourists dragged it out of the water to take photographs with it. There's a video posted online, recorded in the Dominican Republic, and you see a group of men race into the water and then pulling a shark onto the beach with ropes. Some of the people were reportedly lifeguards from the nearby Hard Rock Hotel and Casino in Punta Cana. The shark looks like in the video, which we're not playing, like it gets tangled in the ropes and then starts thrashing violently. Lifeguards then appear to put a life ring over the shark's head and prod it with a plank of wood. And of course, the pictures ended up on social media. They show hotel and casino staff smiling as they lean over the dying shark. Others are holding its tail, making thumbs up gestures. I mean, the entire thing there in the picture is pretty disturbing. The Hard Rock Hotel says it's going to take appropriate action. And earlier this year, there was another incident involving a man pulling a struggling shark out of the water on a Florida beach, pinning it to the sand in order to be photographed. That shark died as well. I remember, Lewis, from kindergarten, that fish tend to die when you take them out of water. And maybe that's something that was lost on some of these individuals.
Yeah, I'm sure that they aren't thinking this animal is going to die. I mean, if they wrangled this in with ropes because they were planning on eating it, maybe I'd feel a little bit differently
I agree with you
about this whole thing.
Not that I'm in favor of eating shark, but if you're talking about if you're capturing animals for nutrition, that is very different than capturing them for social media props.
Right. This isn't happening everywhere. I also saw a video recently where a shark got kind of stranded on the beach, and people saved it.
Yeah.
Instead of photographing themselves with it. Just leave the animals in the water.
Now, I want to go a step further, though.
Okay.
This is horrible. People are stupid. This is a completely senseless act. But I also am reminded that we are doing huge damage to broader ecosystems and habitats.
Oh, yeah.
Corporations are destroying the climate, are destroying our planet. Big business, government seems to be hardly willing to or able to do anything about it. And I'm reminded of that quote, one death is a tragedy and 1 million deaths is a statistic, because as horrible as this is, and as much as it reflects on the individual senselessness and carelessness and stupidity of these individuals, we also have to remember all of the things that are being done that are damaging millions of animals' lives, and it rarely makes the news.
Yes, hundreds of millions. That's why this really doesn't bother me that much, because I often think about all the damage we're doing and how many animals we are killing on a daily basis. This is really nothing, literally nothing compared to that.
We have a really unusual voicemail to play for you. Of course, my voicemail number is 219-2DavidP, which you can call anytime. First, I thought this caller was calling and playing a song, and then I listened to it again and realized the caller is talking in the background, and I don't know if it's by virtue of the fact that some music was playing on their computer and they didn't realize that they were playing music into our voicemail number. I can't explain this, but I think that this may have been accidental. Take a listen. Okay, it goes on like that for several minutes. At first I thought it was a goof, but the words I'm picking up sound like the person is trying to leave a legitimate voicemail and they have no clue that this music is being transmitted.
Maybe. I don't know. It sounds like video game music. It sounds like Minecraft music or something.
Yep. Well, anyway, try again, maybe without the music this time. On the bonus show, we will be talking about a new University of Miami initiative to establish a chair of atheism studies. We are going to talk about, and I don't know that I'm going to love this story, China's dog meat festival. And we will also talk about Mexican police clashing with protesting teachers. All of those stories and more on today's bonus show. There is one way to sign up, which is at davidpakman.com/membership. And remember that tomorrow we will be taking phone calls Wednesday, 1:15 p.m. Eastern Time, 617-830-4750. Make a note in your calendar and give us a call tomorrow.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.